I stood in the bread aisle of my regular grocery store 2 weeks ago with a notepad, and by the time I walked out, I had 10 different loaves I was setting back on the shelf, and only 3 I was willing to put in my cart. Not because of price, not because of taste, because of what was sitting in the ingredient list underneath a picture of golden wheat fields on the front of the package. Ingredients that have nothing to do with flour, water, yeast, and salt, which is all bread has ever needed to exist. My name is Volter. I've farmed for over 20 years. I grow wheat on part of my own land, and my wife bakes real bread in our kitchen every week with 4 ingredients and nothing else. So when I started reading labels at the store, I wasn't guessing at what belonged in a loaf. I knew exactly what I was looking for and exactly what shouldn't be there. Today I'm going to walk you through what I found, category by category, so you can do the same test yourself next time you're standing in that aisle, and then I'll give you the 3 loaves that actually passed. Here's a rule before we get into it, and it's the only rule you really need. Bread is flour, water, yeast, and salt. That's it. That's the entire recipe that's fed people for thousands of years. Everything past those 4 ingredients exists to solve a manufacturing problem, not a bread problem, making a dough easier to handle on an industrial line, making the loaf sit on a shelf for 3 weeks instead of 3 days, making the crumb look softer and whiter than real fermented dough naturally turns out. None of that is illegal. Almost all of it is legal and common. But legal and traditional bread are not the same thing, and once you start reading labels, you'll see how far apart they've drifted. First, the ingredient to watch for above all others, potassium bromate. It's used as a flour improver, it strengthens dough, and helps loaves rise taller and more uniformly on a commercial line. It's banned outright in the European Union, Canada, the United Kingdom, and China. California requires a cancer warning label on products containing it because state regulators classify it as a carcinogen. It is still legal in most of the rest of the United States in limited amounts, which is exactly why it's worth checking for on any commercial loaf, particularly cheaper white sandwich breads and some hamburger and hot dog bun lines, where dough needs to hold shape reliably at high volume. Second, azodicarbonamide, sometimes just listed as ADA. This is a dough conditioner that also happens to be used industrially in the production of foam plastics and yoga mats, which is exactly the detail that made it famous a few years back when a major sandwich chain publicly committed to removing it from their bread after consumer pressure. It's banned in the European Union over respiratory concerns. It's still legal here, and it still shows up in a fair number of mass-produced commercial loaves, particularly the softer, longer shelf life sandwich breads stacked toward the front of most grocery store bread aisles. Third, Datem, a synthetic emulsifier used to strengthen dough and improve loaf volume. It's common enough that you'll find it in a large share of standard commercial sandwich breads, and while it's classified as generally recognized as safe here, some lab research has raised questions about its effects that other countries have taken more seriously than U.S. regulators have. Fourth, calcium propionate, a mold inhibitor that extends shelf life significantly. It's banned in parts of Europe, and there's a study from the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health that linked it to behavioral changes in children, enough that some parents specifically avoid it, even though it's still broadly approved for use here. Fifth, high fructose corn syrup, which has no business being in bread at all. Bread needs almost no sugar to feed the yeast. A small amount of real sugar or honey does the job, but a lot of mass-market loaves, especially the ones marketed toward kids with cartoon packaging, use HFCS as a cheap sweetener and moisture retainer instead. Sixth, soybean oil, and specifically partially hydrogenated versions of it, still turns up in some commercial breads as a dough softener and shelf life extender, even though the trans fat concerns around partially hydrogenated oils have been public knowledge for years. Seventh, bleach flour. This is flour treated with chemical agents to whiten it and make it behave more predictably on an industrial line rather than being aged naturally the traditional way. It's still legal and common in cheaper white breads, and it's one of the easiest things to spot on a label. The word bleached sits right there in front of the word flour. Now let's talk about where these actually show up, because it's less about any one villain brand and more about which category of bread you're grabbing without thinking. Eighth, the classic soft sandwich white bread you grew up with, the kind sold at nearly every grocery store in the country in a plastic bag with a twist tie, is one of the most common places to find several of these additives stacked together. Datum, calcium propionate, sometimes bromated flour, because that category is built entirely around shelf stability and a soft, uniform texture at the lowest possible cost per loaf. Ninth, packaged hamburger and hot dog buns, especially the store brand and discount versions, run into the same problem because a bun has to survive weeks on a shelf and hold its shape around a hot patty or a dog without falling apart, which is exactly the kind of manufacturing challenge these additives exist to solve. 10th, boxed sweetbreads, the cinnamon swirl loaves, and the kids' character-branded sandwich breads tend to stack sugar, HFCS, and preservatives together because they're competing on shelf life and a soft, almost cake-like texture that real bread doesn't naturally have without help. That's the pattern across 10 different corners of a typical bread aisle. Not 10 specific villains out to trick you, but 10 categories built around the same industrial priorities: cheap, shelf-stable, soft, and uniform, which almost never lines up with what makes bread actually good for you or actually simple. Now here are the 3 that passed. The first is Ezekiel 4:9 bread, made by Food for Life, sprouted whole grains, filtered water, yeast, and a touch of sea salt. No added sugar, no oil, no dough conditioners, no preservatives at all, which is exactly why it lives in the freezer section instead of the shelf. It doesn't have the shelf stabilizing chemistry the other loaves rely on to sit at room temperature for weeks. The second is Dave's Killer Bread, specifically their organic lines. Organic whole grains, no high fructose corn syrup, no artificial preservatives, and they've built their whole brand identity around publicly avoiding the additive list I just walked you through, which is worth checking yourself next time you're in the aisle, because formulas can shift over time, and reading the label yourself is always the final word, not a brand's marketing claim. The third is Arnold, specifically their no added nonsense line. The company made a public commitment to drop azodicarbonamide, potassium bromate, artificial preservatives, synthetic colors, bleached flour, partially hydrogenated oils, and high fructose corn syrup from the majority of their products. And they say so plainly on their own packaging, which is the kind of transparency that's rare enough in this aisle that it's worth rewarding with your dollar. I want to be fair here, the same way I try to be fair every time I do one of these. None of these additives are hidden illegally. Every single one is disclosed on the label if you take 30 seconds to flip the loaf over and read it. The problem isn't that companies are breaking the rules. It's that the rules allow a very wide gap between what most people picture when they see the word bread and what a lot of mass-produced commercial loaves actually contain to survive a 3-week shelf life and a cross-country truck route. A company chasing the lowest cost per loaf at the highest shelf stability is going to reach for potassium bromate and calcium propionate every time because it's cheaper and more reliable than real fermentation time and a shorter shelf date, and most shoppers never turn the bag around to check. Here's what I want you to actually do this week. Flip over whatever bread is in your kitchen right now and read the ingredient list straight through, not the front of the bag, the actual list. If it's flour, water, yeast, and salt, maybe with a touch of honey or oil, you're in good shape. If you see potassium bromate or bromated flour anywhere on that list, that's the first one I'd personally put back on the shelf without a second thought, given how many countries have already banned it outright. If you see azodicarbonamide or ADA, same thing, banned across the EU for a reason. And if the ingredient list runs past 10 or 12 items with several words you'd need a chemistry degree to explain, that length alone is telling you something. Real bread has never needed a list that long to exist. I'll leave you with the bigger point because I think it matters past just bread. The same 4-ingredient standard that used to define an entire category of food, flour, water, yeast, salt has quietly become the exception instead of the rule, not because anyone forced that change on you, but because a longer shelf life and a lower cost per loaf were worth more to a manufacturer's bottom line than keeping the recipe the way it's always been. That's not a conspiracy. It's just what happens when nobody's required to make the simple version the default, only the legal one. Tell me in the comments what you find when you flip over your own loaf this week. I read every one of these, and I genuinely like to know how many of you are already buying one of the 3 I mentioned without realizing it was one of the cleaner options out there. And if you've got a local bakery near you making real bread the traditional way, drop the name, because I'd rather build a real list with all of you than assume I've already found every honest loaf in the country. Next time, I want to walk you through the same test on breakfast cereal, because what I found reading those labels was worse than anything on this list. Until then, read the back before you trust the front. And remember, if a farmer wouldn't recognize it as food, it probably isn't.